Kings of Portugal ruled empires, commanded armies, and decided the fate of millions of people, but many of them did not die in glory. Some ended up imprisoned, betrayed by their own family, while others agonized slowly, consumed by diseases, excesses, or poisons. And there were kings who were murdered in broad daylight, and one who simply disappeared in the middle of the desert, leaving an entire country waiting for his return. In today's video, we will learn about the 7 most iconic, tragic, and enigmatic deaths of the kings of Portugal, and understand how the way these men lived determined, in many cases, the way they died. But before we start the video, if you enjoy our content, become a member of our channel right now. That way you'll have access to our group and exclusive content, including live classes. To delve even deeper into the behind the scenes of history, the 7th most iconic death among the kings of Portugal was that of Dom Afonso VI in 1683. Afonso grew up in the shadow of his older brother, Teodosio, and never thought he would one day become king. But when his father and his brother died, he ended up having to take the throne of Portugal. However, he was a notoriously incapable king. Many rumors point to intellectual disability and others to physical disabilities, but the fact is that the king delegated all acts of government. Count of Castelo-Melor. By marrying the French noblewoman Maria Francisca de Saboya, he supposedly never even consummated the marriage. And when the queen wants the removal of the Count of Castelo-Melor and the king doesn't grant her request, she asks for the annulment of her marriage. And later she ends up falling in love with her brother-in-law Pedro, who was the king's younger brother. After managing to maneuver the courts, Francisca and Pedro succeed in removing Afonso, declaring him incapable and making him abdicate the throne, and then imprisoning him in a palace in Sintra. All this while his brother Pedro was marrying his ex-wife Francisca after the Pope annulled his marriage to her. And so, after 15 years of exile and imprisonment, Afonso dies reclusive and silenced in the palace of Sintra. Another very iconic death in the history of Portugal, taking 6th place, was that of Dom Pedro IV, called Dom Pedro I of Brazil. Shortly after making Brazil independent, Pedro returns to Portugal to fight against his brother, Dom Miguel. That's because Miguel had agreed to marry his own niece, Maria de Gloria, who was only 9 years old, and wait until she was old enough to consummate the marriage. Until then, he would be the regent of the kingdom in her name, and later would become her king consort. Miguel decides to crown himself as absolute king in Lisbon, with the support of part of the population and the church. That's when Dom Pedro abdicates the throne of Brazil and entrusts José Bonifacio with the care of the heir, Dom Pedro II, to return to Portugal and defend his daughter's rights. And in Portugal, Pedro fights alongside the liberal troops, sharing the trenches with his men, tending to the wounded, manning cannons, and facing death up close. Precisely because of this, he became known in Portugal as the Soldier King, but the war would leave deep scars on the monarch. In the same year, peace was signed. Pedro IV, who had enjoyed excellent health, was struck by a terrible case of tuberculosis, which he had contracted in the trenches, and so he would die in the same year at the Palace of Queluz. At the time of his death, slavery was already prohibited in Portugal, but it was still allowed in Brazil. And so he wrote an open letter to Brazilians in which he pleaded for the gradual abolition of slavery, comparing this evil to a cancer that was devouring morality and human dignity. And so he died on September 24, 1834, after a long, painful illness, just a few days before turning 36 years old. And as serious as his death was, so was the death of his daughter, Dona Maria II. Maria II Maria was Queen of Portugal and was at the center of the disputes between her father and her uncle, Dom Miguel, to whom she had been promised in marriage. From an early age, however, Maria married Fernando II, a German nobleman, and became pregnant 12 times in just 16 years. That meant, on average, one child every 17 months. Since her first pregnancy at 18, the births were difficult, long, and exhausting. In one of them, in fact, labor lasted 32 hours. And at just 25 years old, already in her fifth pregnancy, the queen was showing clear signs of physical exhaustion. She became obese, developed heart problems, and began to face increasing risks with each new pregnancy. Even though doctors advised her to avoid getting pregnant, the queen insisted on not using any form of birth control. And when warned that she could die, she would say that at least she would die in her position. Some authors argue that she was traumatized by the way her mother, Dona Leopoldina, died, with her father, Pedro, constantly cheating on her with the Marquesa de Santos. And although she did not hold a grudge against her father, she did not refrain from sexual activities with her husband, so as not to create marital problems that could lead to infidelity. Maria too would die painfully, but after complications from the birth of her 11th child, the queen still had time to confess while the doctors were operating on her to try to minimize the effects of the complication. But she ended up passing away in 1853. In fourth place, we have the death of Dom João V. João was king of Portugal in the 18th century and displayed the height of luxury and glory of the Portuguese Empire, especially due to the prominence of gold extracted in Brazil. The king, however, had a serious problem with lust. Throughout his life, he collected countless lovers, ranging from wives of nobles in the kingdom to nuns, earning him the nickname the Nun Chaser. And since Dom João V was always involved with his various lovers, as well as with his wife, with whom he had 6 children, as the years went by, to keep up with all the women he had, he resorted to aphrodisiacs, especially cantharidin, and began to use it constantly. This continued use led the king to suffer from paralysis, which affected the left side of his body, leaving his mouth drooping, and he was probably a victim of a stroke. So the king, always complaining of pain, spent 8 years visiting the hot springs, 100 kilometers from Lisbon, to relieve his comorbidities. The king would die in 1750, always surrounded by much pain after receiving the sacraments. Thirdly, we have the death of Dom João VI in March 1826. João was the last absolute king to reign peacefully in Portugal and lived through one of the most difficult periods to rule. His wife Carlota hated him and conspired against him. His son Miguel was exiled after imprisoning members of the Freemasonry and trying to put an end to liberalism. João, for the Miguelists, was a weak figure who prevented the return of the traditional monarchy, but for the liberals, he was also a living reflection of absolutism. He was the last living absolute Portuguese king. And the successors of Pedro and Miguel embodied factions that divided the country and would later clash in the Civil War. And so, in 1826, after a dinner, the monarch went through a series of vomiting, convulsions, and fainting spells for several days. And whenever he seemed to get better, the king would get worse again. The king agonized for a long and terrible week until he finally passed away and was buried in the Braganza Mausoleum. And curiously, after his entrails and heart were exhumed, more than twice the amount of arsenic needed to kill a person was detected. In other words, Dom João VI was poisoned. Even though there was suspicion of poisoning at the time, nothing could be proven. But now, with the king's death confirmed, the real mystery surrounding the event is who was responsible. In second place, we have the most talked about and theorized death in the entire kingdom, the death of Dom Sebastião at the end of the 16th century. The young king is said to have completely disappeared in the sands of Morocco, in the midst of a true crusade at Al-Qasr Quibir, vanishing during the battle with the Moors. And in this way, the idea of Sebastianism arose, which believed in a miraculous return after the king had entered an enchanted labyrinth. Theorists like Dom Juan de Castro believed that the king had reappeared in Venice. Others thought he had died in prison, while still others recognized a body attributed to the king in Alcácer Quibir. And this doubt and mystery about the death of Dom Sebastião is also transferred to his tomb in the Jerónimos monastery. On his tomb, the epitaph is written, "If we can believe the legend, this tomb holds the remains of Sebastião, who died on African soil. Do not say it is a false belief of those who think he is alive, because glory assures him immortality." The interesting thing about his epitaph is the opening part. It doesn't categorically say that Dom Sebastião is there, but rather that he is there if we can believe what people say. In other words, maybe he is there, maybe he isn't. And this enigma really embodies how deeply Sebastianism became rooted in Portuguese society at the beginning of the 17th century. And finally, first of all, we have the shooting assassination of Dom Carlos and Prince Luís Felipe, which took place at Praça do Comércio in 1908. The regicide was carried out by members of the Portuguese Carbonaria, a secret society with ideals similar to those of Freemasonry and with a strong anti-Catholic stance. They carried out terrorist attacks throughout Europe. One of the regicides threw himself at the car, killing the king. Prince Luís Felipe, who was highly respected in the army and had visited Portugal the previous year, was also in the carriage and always carried a pistol. From there, he quickly managed to fire shots at the assassin, but ended up being hit in the face by another shooter. The queen was driving the assassins away with the only thing she had in her hands, a bouquet of flowers. And she even tried to protect the prince's life under her skirts, but he was already dead. Both regicides were killed that day, as well as the king and the prince, and so Carlos and Prince Luís Felipe rest in the Braganza Pantheon in São Vicente de Fora. And of all the tombs present there, only theirs has the statue of a woman, crying. It was the soul of the nation, mourning the death of its two faithful servants. The reaction throughout Europe was one of great indignation, especially because of the impunity of the other members of the organization, which was made even worse by the establishment of the Republic. The Portuguese Republic, proclaimed 2 years later, was established by an elitist group, which went on to glorify the regicides, treating them as national heroes. Thus, in the early years of the Portuguese Republic, the country went through great disrepute, to the point that the Republican government plunged the country into World War I, sending thousands of Portuguese to the battlefield in an attempt to gain some international prestige from the wealthy European monarchies, while at the same time praising the tomb of the Carbonari regicides. Thus, what is interesting to analyze about the deaths of the kings of Portugal is the variety of fates each one had. They were powerful, influential men who led the nation in times of crisis and prosperity, but who, when faced with the finiteness of life, revealed themselves as men and women of flesh and blood, simple, despised, and who, through their different deaths, remind us of the chilling reality that we can often choose how we live, but almost never how we will die. Although many times the way we live ends up shaping the way we die. And you, did you know about the most iconic deaths of the kings of Portugal? What surprised you the most? Do you think any were missing or that another should have been ranked higher? So go ahead and leave your comment right now to support our work and take the opportunity to become a member of the channel right now. That way, you'll be able to dive deeper and learn even more about the fascinating Iberian history.